Thank you for tuning in today. We're going to talk about perfecting your mobile experience. I'm joined here. My name is John Sullivan. I work on search here at Google, and I'm joined by Luke, who works with Mobify and helps businesses get the most out of the web. Jenny Gove, who works here at Google on UX and led some of the research that we recently published. And I'm here with Manu Lacour, who is a PM on search ads. Quick note on format. I'm going to spend a few minutes asking the panel some questions, and then we'd like to take some questions from those of you in the audience. So during the session, please enter your questions, which you can do directly from the Hangout. And I'd also encourage you, if you haven't already, to download the full research paper at google.com/think/multiscreen. So if I could start with you first, Jenny. I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of an overview of the research, what motivated you to do it, and some of the highlights from your perspective.
Sure. Okay. So we conducted this research because we all know that the mobile web is just growing like really quickly, and we've been giving the message out for a while that it's important to create a mobile presence, but we haven't done so much to talk about, exactly how to do that. And so we wanted to address that need that's out there. And so we decided that the best way to do that was to provide information based on kind of ground truth data. We wanted to make sure that we felt very confident in the advice that we were giving out. So we've decided to run a study in order to do that. And so we did that on 100 different mobile websites. We conducted this research in collaboration with a company called AnswerLab, and we brought in 119 participants for the study, and this was a usability study. So each participant took an hour to go through a few different websites, and we gave them tasks, and we observed them using those websites in order to sort of fulfill those tasks. We had them speak out loud, and we also had them rate the sites that they encountered. And so the real motivation was, to be able to help everybody who's creating a mobile website to do that in a way that's going to provide a really good user experience on that site.
Okay. Well, we'll get into a little bit more detail later. But Luke, I know you spend a lot of time working with businesses and companies and helping them improve their mobile web experience. How is this research changing how you're going to advise your clients, or how are you seeing the mobile web development evolve over time?
It was really exciting, actually, to see this research come out. For us, obviously, we work with a variety of different customers, and certainly they all have unique challenges. So to approach each of their projects in a unique way, we really need to understand exactly how that user, and oftentimes how a customer, is actually going to be interacting with that mobile website. So to see something that was actually documented, from an in-person study, and to actually understand exactly what those users think while they're using a mobile website was really tremendous. Yeah.
Excellent. So Manu, I know you used to be an app developer, and now you spend your days thinking about mobile more broadly than apps across, web and apps. I think what's likely on a lot of folks' mind is, I have fixed resources. Should I go after my mobile site first? Should I develop an app? Should I do both together? How should I think about that? Would love counsel from you on how folks should be thinking about this.
Yeah, it's not always an either or. Because the mobile app and the mobile web are different platforms ultimately, and it depends on the business. There are now more desktop or more mobile internet users than desktop internet users, and some of those are going to find your business through your mobile website. So that's going to happen, and you need a way to handle those users. An app, on the other hand, provides a much more engaging experience for some of you users, but it has a significant barrier to getting users in, and that is downloading it on a on a Play Store or on iTunes. So ultimately, you need to think about who are these users. They're going to be different, and you might want to engage your most loyal users repeatedly through an app versus folks who come in through a specific search or who are visiting your website for the first time on the web.
Okay. So it sounds like everybody needs a mobile site, and then for a particular subset of users, it oftentimes makes sense to invest in an app.
At some level, if you don't have a mobile site, you are just leaving some users that are trying to find you on mobile web without a place to go.
Yeah, fair enough. So if we could go back to the design principles for a minute, I'd love to hear a little bit more about, 25 is a lot. Where do you think folks should start, or what are the things you think that they really need to get right?
Sure. So, 25 might sound a lot, but it's important to look at any one of these because there's, all of these experiences across your mobile website could cause somebody to sort of fail to check out if they're purchasing something, or. But in terms of where should you start, I think it's really what Manu was just talking about. It's all about identifying what's kind of the unique case for the mobile web for your business. And I heard sort of anecdotally a company talking the other day about how they consider their app to be an experience that's kind of engaging for users, those users that want to stay with them long term. There's also, I think, a really important reason to build an engaging experience on the mobile web as well. And that's because a lot of your customers will continue to use that sort of longer term as well. So where should you start? Really understanding what's unique for you on mobile. And so this isn't just about taking that desktop experience and recreating it on mobile. It's thinking about your business, where it's unique for you, and also thinking about, the phone and what you can do with the phone that's different than you can do on desktop. So I'd start there, but then within that, there's some important things we can look at. It's like prioritizing those calls to action. We found search to be extremely important, especially for retail sites. On non-retail sites, when people couldn't find what they were looking for immediately in the calls to action, they would turn to search secondarily. So, those are two, for example, really key principles that I think all companies need to think about.
Makes sense. Luke, I'd love to hear your perspective on how are these principles, or how should they be applied differently by business model, and how do you advise clients that are online retailers versus folks who are more interested in generating leads versus other business types?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of the principles, and I definitely encourage everyone to download that resource. It's a fantastic reference piece, really. But depending on whether you're in a retail focus or if you're in more of a lead generation focus with your business's website, ultimately it's about understanding the customer and what their primary goals are going to be. So for a retail environment, a lot of the time it's that browse sort of activity where someone's actually just starting off to look for a product, and then really understanding the motions that they want to go through. What's their desired course of action? They want to maybe compare some products. They want to get in sort of a detailed view of each product and actually understand what it's like up close. So I think there's some principles in the study that actually speak to that. Needing to be able to zoom in very, very close on particular, for example, articles of clothing to check the details. So for that retail environment, it's a lot about delivering a phenomenal experience to that shopper, especially because they may want to finish that journey on that mobile device. Some may be browsing to then go offline, for example.
Right.
But in a lot of cases now, we're actually seeing that really ultimately people do like to check out if it's easy to do. For someone who's really focused more on the lead generation side of things, I think it's more about really understanding what are the typical friction points for them in that journey. And in terms of the destination that they want to end up at, how can you actually understand typically what's more instinctive to them in terms of what actions do they look to take, and therefore comparing that to the mobile website that you're offering today and just checking to see that they actually match up, to really make sure that you've got all of the features in the right places and that the steps make sense in a logical order.
Makes sense. So Manu, if I could get back to you.
Sure.
I know you've spent some time developing apps, developing web. Now you're thinking across both and designing products for Google. Are there particular pitfalls that you either experienced as you were, or challenges as you were developing things, or things that you're now observing as you work across a lot of clients at Google? Are there certain things that you'd say, and I think Jenny touched a little bit on this earlier, areas where you think businesses should try to avoid, or things that we know aren't working?
I'd say two categories of pitfalls. So one, generally forgetting to place yourself in the situation that your mobile users will be in. And so a lot of businesses try to translate their desktop site and all the functionality of their desktop site into mobile, but that's not always the best course of action. So in the hotel industry, for example, some sites started with just translating their desktop functionality. Then they realized that one of the main use cases their mobile users would have is finding a last-minute deal. So they brought that call to action front and center above the fold when you get to your mobile website. And if you go to their desktop equivalent, it's buried somewhere deep within that site. So you need to find some of these use cases, really surface them, and make them very visible. So that's one sort of thing, and that's really important. The other is sort of getting all the low-hanging fruit, and the principles can be really helpful here because you just go through the list, you figure out what are you maybe doing wrong. One example is credit card entry, right? When you're in a form entering your credit card number, you can actually tell what credit card someone's using from the number, whether it's Visa, MasterCard, Discover, etc. But a lot of sites still ask you what credit card type you're using. So there's a lot of things like that. Every tap counts on mobile. So making sure you just streamline all those frictions is really important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, actually. I think especially with something like a booking journey, it can be quite complex,
Right.
and it's something that we can achieve easily on a desktop computer or on a laptop, but it actually takes quite a lot of forethought to actually develop that journey on a mobile device. For example, a calendar picker, is something that's tremendously important, and actually really using, the right sort of form field type. So I think, in the study there's talk of kind of, is it a drop down, is it a selection, like a binary selection type form field.
That's right.
And that's infinitely more important, I think, in that mobile environment because people get frustrated quickly.
Yeah.
And to Luke's point about that journey, you have to think about your journey on your customer's journey on mobile in the context of all their devices. It's not their mobile users or desktop users. They're users that are accessing your site on mobile or desktop. So can you maybe give them the ability to explore on mobile and then sort of switch to desktop or save some of their information and later.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'd love you guys to talk a little bit more about what's best in class for cross-device, because we keep talking about cross-device.
In the study, we saw participants quite painfully go to the extent of, copying and pasting the URL, then opening their email client, pasting it in, sending it to themselves. So, people want to do that. It's clear that they want to do that. And so if we can provide a way for them to pick up either later, just because they've got something else to do right now and they want to continue with this later, or perhaps they want to see something more in-depth on a bigger screen. So various reasons people want to do it. And we saw some sites, provide the ability to support those activities by, in the right place at the right time, enabling them to email themselves more product details, pin things, just different ways that they can capture that information to pick up where they left off.
I think with that in mind, actually, it's tremendously important from my point of view when you're looking at a mobile website and actually creating that experience. And also, obviously, we're also looking at tablet optimization as well these days is really important this year especially. If you're doing that and you're starting to look at how the user might share a URL with themselves, it's really, really important to consider if you're thinking about a mobile site that's going to be at a separate address, if there's an M dot or a T dot in front of that address and it's actually going to be a separate or a different URL, really either make sure that you're using a technology that has the redirects in place for them to work, or look to a technology solution that gives you the same URL no matter what device you're on, because otherwise people can end up in these odd kind of dead ends, which I'm not sure if you saw in the study, but if someone shares one of those, M dot links, they might end up seeing this really weird looking, sort of view on their desktop site later on. Yeah,
that's a good point. So if you guys could talk a little bit about who's nailing it from your experience. So you worked with a bunch of companies. I know you spend your day working with companies helping them improve.
Well, I think there's probably no single company that's probably adhering to every single principle right now, but there are certainly some companies that are doing a really good job. So in the study, we saw that, Macy's had made some really good changes for their mobile website. Things like having a really nice, clear search bar at the top. It wasn't hidden behind an icon. They did a really good job of having shorter menus. So if you look at their desktop site versus their mobile site, the menu structure is quite different, and it's specific for mobile, and it's easy to navigate because the items in the menu are pretty distinct. So it's clear for the user to tell, I'm going to the right place here. Right. So that would be one example.
In broad strokes, actually, from our experience working with a variety of different customers, ultimately, the people who nail it the best are those who understand their customers or their users the best. So I think, the checklist and the 25 points are incredibly important to look at on a granular basis. But what we really see is that, those companies who understand their customers and understand how they interact and sort of how they want to deliver that brand experience, through a mobile website, are those that then ultimately create the best customer experience. So I think it is definitely worth the investment in actually understanding a customer, to that degree. And there's a few different ways that you can go about doing that.
Yeah. So I've heard a lot from clients that I've spoken with that, this is really hard. And they say, how long is this going to take? What sort of guidance can you give on, is this a couple-month journey? Is this, a couple of years? From your experience, how long does it take if your site right now, if you're thinking it's not great, how do I go from bad to good to excellent? What sort of time horizon, how much are you thinking about in terms of investments?
This is a question for you, Luke.
Yeah, I think I can speak to some experience, even actually, just from the last few months working with some of our customers. It really all depends on where you're starting from. So at the moment, if you're serving a desktop site, to a mobile device, ultimately there's a few different routes that you can take. And obviously, some folks would like to build in-house, and that's understandable, and others look to a vendor as well. Typically, we see someone come to a vendor because they want to move quickly. They may have a time driver on a calendar that they need to hit for a certain event. Or they may just feel like they may be a little overdue, compared to some of their competitors, for example, who may have acted a little earlier than them. So in that case, we really look and ultimately, you can deliver a really fantastic mobile experience in sort of an 8 to 16 week project. It depends a lot on the complexity of the site, of course. But the other thing that you can start looking at now as well, and I mentioned tablet optimizations, but that could be as small as a 6 week project, for example, where you're actually tweaking a desktop site to really make it finger friendly, swipeable, touch friendly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, I'd also add that, sometimes it can be a little bit of an art as opposed to a science as well, and you might have to iterate. So you got to put a site out there and then try to learn what your mobile use case is. And, having been an app developer in the past, there are definitely tons of people out there that are thinking about your business case on mobile already. So it's better to get out there, start figuring that out before someone else does.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we always support, customers who are looking to iterate, because I think that's the only way to go about it. You need to learn from how people use that first version.
One thing to avoid, though, when you're rolling out this, is to have some parts of your site that people would navigate through be mobile optimized and some not. So, you have to think carefully about which, if you do need to split it up into sections, sort of keep it contained such that the experience would be all within kind of mobile optimized or not mobile optimized. We found in the study that navigating through screens, some of which were mobile optimized, and then you'd hit a part of the site that was non-mobile optimized, was a worse experience all around.
Yeah, I had one of those very recently, and it was quite painful.
Yeah.
I won't name the company. So let's say your site isn't great. You read the principles. Jenny, what's your take? Where do you start first?
Yeah, I think we've touched on this a lot already. It's all about sort of understanding what the unique use case is for mobile for your customer. So I really think that's it. And then that actually leads you into one of the first principles, because that helps you surface those key call to actions on your homepage. And from there, you're in a good position, to take people through the various flows that they need to go through on your website.
Okay, makes sense. So I think it's about understanding your customers, making sure you understand the mobile use cases, evaluating how you're performing relative to the principles, and figuring out a plan of action, using a vendor if you don't have the in-house resources. So I think good next steps are download the full report, again, at google.com/think/multiscreen. And I think now we'll move to some of the audience questions. So I think we've touched on this a little bit, but would love your perspective, Jenny and Luke and Manu. What were some of the more surprising principles? I have my view, having read all of them, but I'd love the experts here.
Well, interestingly enough, one of them, I think, for us was we weren't quite sure, how important search would be. That might sound surprising coming from Google, but the reason was because we were very aware that people can find it, and some people can find it quite a painful experience to have to type on mobile. So we were wondering, what is navigation right up there as well? And of course, all of it's very important, but we really found search to be extremely important on mobile. And it's really because often the mobile use case is a rather urgent one, and people want to get to where they need to go here and now, and they want to get that answer. So not so much surprising, but sort of validating that actually search is really important on mobile. And another one I bring up is kind of, you might think it's kind of a smaller thing on mobile, but a lot of sites link out to their desktop site. Now, I think our position is probably that you should be ultimately providing an experience on mobile where, just as Luke said, you can do the whole thing on mobile, and there's no need to link out to that other site that you have. We found in the study what was interesting is that terminology really matters. So if you say something like full site or link to full site, then the user's perception of that is like, well, this isn't full, this isn't providing me everything I need, there's something that's not so good about this site. And so think about the terminology you use. It's something I haven't really considered before, but using something like desktop site, if you really need to link out to that site, would be a better way to go.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Also, one of the interesting sort of points from my perspective actually speaks to search, and that is the search results. So, obviously it's tremendously important to deliver relevant search results, but more specific than that, what I learned from the study was that if a user doesn't see what they're looking for in those initial results, they're not likely to search again. They're going to want to actually try to filter. And so, that sort of filtering and narrowing down that search is tremendously important. And then actually, sort of ironically, it's actually quite difficult to perfect that experience as well. It's one of the more challenging things, I think, to achieve on a mobile screen. But
I think one of the things is looking where the filters are. So we saw some kind of interesting experience where the filters were there, they'd been implemented, but they weren't able to be found easily. They were sort of, you had to scroll right down off the screen to find the filters. So, making sure those filters are visible up front, that really helps users narrow down their search results, and that's going to give them a much more satisfying experience. And that's just one of the ways that can be enabled to help people narrow their search results, which is really critical.
So, related question, and you touched on this a little bit. One of the questions from the audience was, I have a desktop site, I'm thinking about porting it over. How should I think about prioritizing content? And you talked a little bit about it with use cases and understanding your customers. But if you could give a little bit of guidance, if you have a great mobile or a desktop site that you spent a ton of time optimizing, how do you think about then porting that over to mobile?
I think one really important consideration is that with that desktop site and with the investment that would have been made into that site already, it's very important to consider that some of the alternatives for going mobile may include a rebuild of that desktop site, and that's not necessarily ideal because it may actually negatively impact conversion rates in that case. So certainly, check out all of the options. There are definitely options that exist where you can start to build that mobile experience and deliver a much better experience on mobile without sort of disrupting, what you've already built. I think it's important to think about that. And then, like has already been said already, understanding the primary goals, maybe the top 3 things that someone is likely to want to do on your particular website, understanding the customer, and then designing around those goals.
Right. I think that's right. I think ultimately, it comes to your question as well about some of the pitfalls. Ultimately, people want to get to the same things that they want to get to on desktop. So ultimately, everything needs to be there in terms of content. It just might need to be arranged differently because of the unique use case of mobile. But if you don't have kind of everything there in terms of content, then it kind of breaks the mental model that users have constructed of your company or your site down. And it's very confusing and then dissatisfying. So
I'd really put yourself in the shoes of your user, and so do thought experiments and do studies and figure out who they are, what their situation is when they are accessing your site. Think about if your user was to call you when they were on the go, what information would they immediately want? What 3 questions would they ask? And maybe some of those things are important.
That's a fantastic point. And I think as well as perhaps doing some user studies, also look to your analytics, to understand what people are actually doing at the moment, and start to use that as your starting point of understanding their behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going back to something that you said earlier, Mana, there are questions coming out around forms. So the question is, collecting leads in the education space, how should we design and think about forms to help improve conversion rates? So I know it's pretty specific, but
that is very specific. Forms in the education space.
Well, I think we should talk more broadly about forms and best practices there. I think this is.
I can take that to begin with if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Another thing that you mentioned was what are some great examples, and I think Progressive has provided a really great example of their their form. So, you know, firstly, the thing that I noticed about their form was it's not one long big form on the mobile device. You know, you can chunk that form into manageable portions and have some of the easy to input things first, and then have nice progress bar, labeled progress bar, so people know where they're getting. And then there's other things with mobile forms specifically, such as enabling the numeric keypad to come up when you're going to enter numbers, and auto-advancing the cursor into the next field if you're entering a phone number or a date of birth or something like that. So the other thing is, if possible, you know, validating as you go along, because there's nothing worse than, you know, filling in a whole form, submitting it, and then having to filling it all over again.
Absolutely. Or worse, having to hunt to find what the incorrect field is.
Right.
You know, sometimes you actually have to scroll up and down and actually search for it.
As a whole, the important thing I keep in mind is all the little frictions count. Just like watch every single tap, swipe you're requiring of your users, because when you're on the go, it's pretty annoying. If you fill out a field and then the page reloads and says you forgot, you know, the area code on your phone number, right? Like that's just a frustrating experience. So watch every single little thing. And if you look at the UX principles, a lot of the ones around forms are these small frictions. Individually, they're unsurprising, but together they create a more cohesive experience.
Yeah, they definitely add up. And actually, a tip there that's in the study, which I thought was fantastic, is on form labeling. And that is that if you're using a label that actually sits inside of the form field, so it disappears when someone starts typing in there, that people actually sometimes lose their place. And I think there's an example of someone filling in an email address rather than a street address, just because the form field wasn't labeled adequately. So I think it's very easy for a user to lose their place on such a small screen. So the more that you can do for them to just help them understand where they are, what's required of them in that step, and then help them progress through.
And lastly, maybe on the lead gen question, laser focus, right? Like if you have a little link giving extraneous information during your within your form, you could lose a lot of folks. And some of the best forms I've seen just have 4 or 5 fields and a button saying sign me up.
Yeah, definitely. And also thinking about how maybe you can follow up with that lead later on to collect more of that information that you might need, so you do get a form complete with 4 or 5 fields rather than asking for 13, for example.
Yeah. Makes sense. I go back to your point about friction points. So one of my big takeaways from the research was that the details matter. Certainly they matter on desktop, but it seems to take on heightened importance on mobile. You're dealing with a smaller screen. You're dealing with folks that are on the go oftentimes. One final question, I think, and then we'll have to wrap up. This, I think, is on a lot of folks' minds. I certainly get the question quite a bit. And the question is, should we develop custom experiences on a mobile site or create seamless experience using responsive design? So I guess maybe I first would hand it to you.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I think we certainly have this discussion on a weekly basis with customers coming to us, and obviously responsive design these days is being favored by a lot of companies, and we certainly see that being able to achieve sort of one website that adapts its content according to screen size and orientation is a fantastic step forward. But it's also important to remember that responsive design isn't a conversion optimized design necessarily. So although it may achieve a foundational level of that adaptability, which we do favor because it's a single code base, there's actually a lot more that you really need to consider if you're looking to really perfect and optimize the user experience on each of those screens. So we see responsive design definitely as the way forward, but we see it more of a foundational level rather than sort of the final way to get there.
Makes sense.
Yeah, nothing to add really. It's not just about diminishing your making your desktop experience fit on mobile. It's in a responsive way. You've got to think much more deeply about it.
Makes sense.
I couldn't have said it better.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming here, particularly Luke, who flew down from Vancouver this morning. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in live to the Hangout. Again, I'd encourage you to download the full report again at google.com/think/multiscreen. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.